Hi there, Year 9, and welcome to your next history lesson. This is lesson number 3 in your series on the British sector of the Western Front. My name is Mr. James. I'll be your teacher for this lesson. And as you can see, our title to this lesson is What Illnesses Did Soldiers Contract on the Western Front? Now, let's make sure you're ready for the lesson. So you need 3 things, and you don't need a couple of other things. So make sure you've got your history workbook in front of you. Obviously, you're going to need a pen. Some scrap paper would probably be useful. And then make sure you've turned off all your distractions. So don't do this in front of the TV and put your phone to one side, even switching it off or putting it in a drawer, just so you're not thinking about it would be good. If you need to press pause at this point to get yourself ready, do so. Now, last lesson with Mr. Sandbrook, you would have looked at the key battles on the Western Front. Remember, this is just in the British sector. And he would have taught you about 4 key battles. You can see them there as options in our Do Now task. You've got Arras, Cambrai, Passchendaele, and the Somme. So, here's your knowledge recall task. Remember, we're trying to get these things into your long-term memory. So we're going to go over them repeatedly. So 5 questions. The question for every single one is which battle, and then as you can see, you've got a choice of 4. So press pause at this point, give yourself some time, take a go at them, and we'll see how you did. Okay, so question number 1 was this: which battle saw the first mass tank attack? You should have answered Cambrai for that one. That was in 1917. Question 2 says this: which battle was the third battle of Ypres? That should be Passchendaele. Question 3: which battle saw the first blood bank used? Again, that's 1917 in Cambrai, and in some future lessons, we'll be looking at how that blood bank was actually set up. Question 4 says this: which battle resulted in 57,000 casualties on the first day? And you should have answered the Somme for that. And then lastly, number 5, which battle was fought on chalky soil, allowing medical treatment to take place underground? And that should be Arras. Take a moment to pause and compare your answers to the ones that are correct and give yourself a mark out of 5. Now, as said, in our lesson today, we're going to look at what illnesses soldiers contracted on the Western Front. We have 3 objectives. A lot of this is to do with knowledge to begin with, so our first objective is you just need to know the main illnesses contracted by soldiers on the Western Front. You need to know their names, and you need to know how they were contracted. Once you've got that, then number 2, as you can see, is this: we need to describe the methods of prevention and treatment used by the British Army for these illnesses. And then lastly, you're going to be really good if you can explain the links between the nature of trench warfare and the illnesses that soldiers contracted. How was it that the nature of this war, the First World War, the fact that it was fought in trenches, how did that produce these particular illnesses? So at this point, you need to find your knowledge organizer, and we need to highlight 3 or 4 things, not too many for this one. So the first thing you need to do is this: is you need to go up to number 3 of themes, and you need to, as you can see, highlight there conditions requiring medical treatment on the Western Front. Hopefully your highlighting is better than mine. You then need to go down to vocabulary. You should see number 6 there. It says gangrene. Okay, so you need to know a bit about gangrene. Okay, number 6 of vocabulary. Lastly, you then need to go down to this bottom right hand corner, and you can see treating and preventing illness. We need to highlight all 3 of these, everybody. Good. Once you've done that, you can pop that away, and then we're going to give you a bit of context to the illnesses on the Western Front. So here's your first activity, 3.2 in your booklet, your starter. Your job is to look at source A, which is this, in detail. 2 questions. What's going on here? And then number 2, can you make 3 suggestions as to why they're doing this? If you'd like to go further, you might want to consider this. Number 1, how might trench warfare contribute to problems with soldiers' feet? And number 2, how will this improve the chances of Britain winning the war? Press pause and write your ideas down now. Okay, here's what I came up with for source A. The first one talks about, well, what's going on in the source? And you can see here a medical officer is inspecting the soldiers' feet. You can tell they're medical officers because can you see in the background one of them is wearing an armband that gives us a slight clue. Question 2 is, why might they be doing this? Well, here's my 3 reasons. Number 1, the medical officer is checking and inspecting the health of the soldiers' feet. The second idea I came up with was that he's checking that soldiers are keeping good care of their feet. Are they perhaps following instructions that they've been given? And then lastly, my third point was he's obviously checking to see if there's any possible illness or infection before it becomes too serious to treat. At this point, pause the PowerPoint and compare your ideas to mine. Were they similar? Were they different? And if you had a go at the go further questions, what did you come up with? Now, we're learning about illnesses of World War One. There's a few things that we need to know to put this into context. You're aware that the nature of trench warfare meant that the First World War became a war of attrition. And what we mean by that is that it became quite defensive. Armies were concerned with wearing the opposition down rather than going on the attack. It becomes a war that's stationary rather than one where there's lots of movement of troops. Obviously, it's not stationary the whole time, but for the vast majority of time, the trenches do not move very far. And if they do so with great difficulty. So the First World War becomes a war of attrition. We're trying to wear the opposition down. Because the soldiers are therefore often stationary, they're exposed to the elements and changes in the weather. This is outdoors, like any war, but you're at the mercy of the weather conditions because you're stationary and not particularly well sheltered. We can also say this, the nature of trenches means that soldiers lived in close proximity with one another. And as you know, that can often encourage illnesses to spread. And lastly, we can say this, that as those armies became keen to wear the opposition down, increasingly heavy bombardment was used, using large artillery guns to target the enemy. Now, we can say this, if that's the nature of trench warfare, then the conditions of the trenches were particularly poor. And this could very much depend on the season of the year. So, in summer, trenches would often smell awful. For one reason, that's because they're unhygienic, and so there'd be the smell of sewage. But for another reason, in no man's land, and possibly even in some trenches, there'd obviously be dead bodies. And so, the smell from those in the summer, as the heat made it intensify, would be awful. At the same time, in the winter, soldiers were obviously exposed to the cold and wet, often resulting in flooding, as you can see in that bottom picture there. Not a pleasant thought, but that led often to things like rat infestations being very common. What are the consequences of this? Well, thousands of soldiers suffered from frostbite for one, as in wintertime it was so cold. But more importantly for us, other illnesses spread through the British Army because of the nature and conditions of trench warfare. You need to know about 3 illnesses that British soldiers contracted during World War One. You can see them here. You need to know about shell shock, trench fever, and trench foot. Let's start with shell shock. Shell shock was not actually called shell shock to begin with. In fact, the Army's code for it was NYDN, not yet diagnosed, nervous. Eventually, that came to be known as shell shock. We might call it PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder today. The term shell shock, though, is used to describe a psychological health problem, as in it affects your brain, in where soldiers display a reaction to the danger that they faced. Because World War One was dangerous. Men would experience days on end of being bombarded by enemy shells at the risk of dying. There would be the noise from those explosions. They would witness friends and colleagues dying. And the stressful conditions of that caused some men to have symptoms like tiredness, nightmares, headaches, shaking, and mental breakdown. In fact, army commanders were very worried that this would spread throughout the British Army as an epidemic. And so you need to know about the measures they took to try and combat shell shock. The second disease that you need to know about is trench fever. Trench fever is less famous, but was devastating to the British Army. It was spread by lice, often found in the seams of clothing and blankets. These lice, because of their colouring, came to be known as greybacks by British soldiers. Trench fever was a bit like the flu today. If you caught it, you'd receive a high temperature, severe headaches would follow, there'd be shivering, pain in the joints, and this would last for about 5 days and actually keep on returning. Hence it was known as relapsing fever. The last illness was the most famous of World War One, and that was trench foot. During the winter months, particularly when it was wet, trenches easily flooded. And, if you can imagine, soldiers standing in that for hours and hours, possibly even days on end, led to them contracting an awful condition affecting their feet. Trench foot was a major problem for the British Army and one that needed to be solved. Again, you need to know how the British Army attempted to prevent and treat this illness. Now we've taught you a bit about illnesses on the Western Front. Your job is to try your main activities, 3.3 on your work booklet. Read the resources that have been given for you, and as you can see, you've got 4 tasks on the back, A, B, C, and D. At this point, pause the PowerPoint and complete those 4 activities. Now you know a bit more about the illnesses on the Western Front. If you want to do some further research, then please do look at activity 3.4. You're looking at the picture, or pictures I should say, of 3 of the most important English authors of the 20th century. You've got A.A. Milne, who wrote Winnie the Pooh. You've got C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, of which you can see the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe there. And you've got J.R.R. Tolkien, who famously wrote the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Each of these men were in the trenches during World War One, and each of them contracted trench fever. Research their views on the war, and see if you can find a quote from each that you think sums up their view well. If you can, explain what you think the quote is saying. Lastly, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, everybody, where you can see all of your history teachers making the lessons for Year 9 and for other year groups. Have a wonderful day, and well done. That's lesson 3 complete.